My name is Andre Gonoella. Welcome to the Burn Bag Podcast. I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast today General David Petraeus. General Petraeus is a retired U.S. Army general, and he also served as the former director of the CIA. He graduated with distinction from the U.S. Military Academy, earning a PhD from Princeton University as well. He served for 37 years in the U.S. Army, culminating his time in uniform with 6 consecutive commands as a general officer, 5 of which were in combat, including the command of the Surge in Iraq, U.S. Central Command, and the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. He has held academic appointments at 6 universities and is currently a senior fellow and lecturer at Yale. He is also a prominent commentator on contemporary security issues and global affairs, and he is currently a partner at KKR and chairs KKR's Global Institute. Co-authored with Andrew Roberts, the newest edition of his book, Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Gaza, is out right now. General Petraeus, thank you again, as always, for joining me here today.
Good to be with you. Thanks.
So, General, how has warfare evolved over the last 80 years since the end of World War II?
Well, it's evolved enormously. First of all, there have been limits in virtually every conflict because we've never seen the use of nuclear weapons again. Since that first use against Japan to bring a close to the Pacific campaign in World War II. There's been a return of guerrilla warfare, of insurgency, of terrorism, and now we see real full-scale conventional warfare, of course, with Russia's invasion again of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion in 2022. But also the introduction of increasing numbers of unmanned systems. And over time, I think that many of those systems will not just be remotely piloted, they will be algorithmically piloted. So there's been a continuous evolution of warfare, still many qualities that are the same as always, the importance of strategic leadership, that at the very top that has to get the big ideas right, has to communicate them effectively, oversee their implementation, determine how to refine them as the situation evolves, to do it again and again and again. And that is a constant. In fact, as you will have seen in the book, Andrew Roberts and I, in the introduction, lay out the strategic leadership intellectual construct that I used for the Surge in Iraq, Central Command, Afghanistan, CIA, and in the business world as well, because we think that's a prism through which you should examine conflict, given that it is often the quality of the strategic leadership that determines which side wins, but not always. In fact, you see in Ukraine a very challenging situation for the Ukrainians, despite very impressive strategic leadership by President Zelensky and his military leadership. Remember, his first big idea was, I don't want to ride, I want ammunition. I'm going to stay in Kyiv. My family's going to stay here. We're going to defend Kyiv. Men are going to stay in the country. His communication skills were exceptional. He was an actor, after all, comedian who played the president so effectively that he won the presidency. His example was exemplary. He took off his business suit and put on a military uniform that he's been in ever since, inspirational, energetic, at the front lines, pinning on medals at memorial services, speaking to the allied countries, the coalition countries, supporting Ukraine around the world and so forth, and refining the big ideas constantly, especially now, making very, very impressive use of, again, unmanned systems in the air, at sea, where they've sunk a third of the Russian Black Sea fleet and pushed them out of the Western Black Sea. And then also now the introduction of ground robotic systems of various types as well.
You know, it's really interesting to observe the war in Ukraine, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But, you know, sort of going back to the evolution of warfare, that your really great book, you know, I think it's really a textbook reading for a lot of students of military strategy and just how warfighting actually occurs. You know, going back to the beginning of that book, you know, how would you describe warfare during the Second World War? What did we define it as?
Well, I think it was unlimited would be the way. That's the characteristic that I think is most apt. Ultimately, again, the use of first and only use of nuclear weapons. But of course, there were virtually no limits, some limits to be sure, but again, firebombing of cities, frankly, very, very extensive damage and destruction and loss of life. Again, the majority of the world was at war. Very, very substantial conventional forces deployed on every side. Again, nations mobilized. Everyone was pitching into the effort. So again, I think the most important characteristic, though, is that there were seemingly no limits. And now, of course, there have always been limits because those that have had nuclear weapons have not used them, even when they have, in essence, lost wars. And despite threats to use them by Vladimir Putin most recently, it does not appear that he will use them. I think that those have proven to be empty threats, especially when his partner without limits, China, and oil destination India, the leaders of each country very publicly cautioned him against even thinking about using nuclear weapons.
So, I mean, this may be a dumb question, of course, but I sort of want to dig deeper into, how the advent of nuclear weapons in 1945 actually significantly changed, not only how military personnel thought about warfare, but also about how policymakers thought about warfare. I mean, you talk about the limits. Were the limits sort of exclusively due to the advent of nuclear weapons, or was it due to other sort of destruction?
No, there were other limits. I think there was a global recoil, frankly, at some of the damage and destruction and loss of innocent civilian life and so forth, the Holocaust, all of this. And so, of course, there was the adoption of the Geneva Conventions, the laws of land warfare. And by and large, most civilized countries have worked very hard to abide by those. We certainly did in the years that I was privileged to be a commander in the wars of the post 9/11 period. That doesn't mean that we didn't make mistakes. Abu Ghraib is a stain that will be there forever. Indelible images, mistaken activities at a detention facility just west of Baghdad. But again, even there, we've learned from that. And again, you cannot go wrong, I don't think, if you just go back to what it is that we've studied and trained on, which is the Geneva Convention and again, the laws of land warfare. So that is usually the intellectual foundation on which our rules of engagement are based. That doesn't mean that, again, Russia adheres to this in any respect. One only has to visit Bucha, north of Kyiv, to see how they treated innocent civilians. And it's a pretty horrific, barbaric treatment that one becomes acquainted with in such a visit, which I've done. I'm just back, in fact, recently from my fourth trip to Ukraine in the last 18 months.
General, in the post World War II era, you covered this a little bit in your book in a really good chapter. We saw a series of wars of decolonization. What trends did we see in the nature of that war fighting and perhaps the gaps between the two different types of forces?
Well, what you typically saw were forces that were animated by nationalism, sometimes by an ideology as well. So you have a combination of a desire to be free, if you will, of the colonial masters that oversaw areas in the past, sometimes coupled with some kind of political and economic ideology associated with communism or what have you. But you saw a number of these, and these are tough wars for the colonial powers that are trying to hang on to these locations. We saw it with the French in Indochina, French in Algeria, the British quite masterfully in Malaysia, in part because they said, we will allow you to become independent, but we're also going to combat the communist guerrillas, insurgents, if you will, who are trying to take control of the country. By the way, that's, of course, the first war in which the term hearts and minds emerged. A very, very skillful civil military campaign plan there. I think one that was very, very impressive. You saw other cases of just insurgency within an existing country, such as Oman, where the young Sultan Qaboos, having just graduated from Sandhurst and overthrown his father, partners with very skillful British leadership in putting down the Dhofar rebellion. Again, that was more of an ideological / power quest by those particular guerrillas. But what you see is, again, in a way, the Maoist insurgency concept play out, where you start out as guerrillas and you gradually get further strength and build up until you can confront the enemy in a conventional form, or sometimes you go back down and back and forth. So again, this is the era of insurgency, which we of course revisited in combating the insurgencies that arose in Iraq in the wake of the liberation of that country from the Saddam Hussein regime, and then in Afghanistan in the wake of the liberation of that country from the Taliban regime, which was required because they refused to turn over Al Qaeda and the leadership that had overseen the planning for and training of the 9/11 attackers.
So, for a non-militarily minded audience or those who weren't familiar with, national security or foreign policy, how do we define an insurgency? We hear that term insurgency again and again, particularly in the post 9/11 wars, particularly in the context of your career, and then, in the context of Vietnam and those wars of decolonization. But, what are the elements of a successful insurgency?
Well, first of all, it is in the category of irregular warfare. I should note that we, of course, had some in our own hemisphere. In fact, I got to be a bit of a observer of the insurgency, the counterinsurgency campaign in El Salvador, which is really quite an impressive civil military counterinsurgency campaign, very much operating on a plan developed by an American two-star at that time. And I was privileged to be a special assistant for the four-star theater commander over a couple of months between my first and second years teaching at West Point. And again, we saw that there. That was an ideological insurgency, Marxist-Leninist, if you will, communist, what have you. Often, again, these are because of perceived income inequality and the rest of that, sometimes real income inequality. You saw the insurgency in Colombia at that time as well, which lasted for quite some time. Then there was the insurgency in Nicaragua. Again, that was, of course, now well publicly known, supported by the United States. So this is irregular warfare. It's not conventional warfare. It's not tanks and mechanized vehicles and artillery and aircraft and all the rest of that. It is much more, again, war among the people. Often the insurgents, guerrillas, terrorist extremists don't wear uniforms. They carry out raids, improvised explosive device attacks, suicide bombings that we saw quite a bit of in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so again, and what was interesting about my years in Iraq was that it began. The fight to Baghdad, of course, was largely a conventional campaign. And you had our very large armored mechanized infantry division, 3rd Infantry Division, 101st Airborne Division. We had 250 helicopters and a whole division of infantry, part of the 82nd Airborne Marine divisions and other forces. And we were fighting, again, in a conventional mode, even though some of the enemy was already fighting in a somewhat irregular fashion. But we had real battles with real Republican Guards, combined arms forces, and so forth. Not that they did particularly well against our forces. But that was, again, a conventional campaign that toppled the Iraqi military forces, forced Saddam Hussein and his senior leaders to flee, and again took down a pretty barbaric, horrific regime. But of course, what followed had not been planned for sufficiently. Lots of mistakes made in the immediate wake of that, including a disastrous decision to fire the Iraqi military without telling them how it would enable them to provide for their families and themselves, and then firing the bureaucrats, the level 4 Ba'ath Party members, and all the bureaucrats basically that we needed were in that category without an agreed reconciliation process. So we created hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, some of whom were military trained, and others of whom were the ones we needed to help run a country we didn't sufficiently understand. And their incentive was to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support it. And that was really where you saw the seeds of the insurgency planted. Then, of course, you had the advent there of Islamist extremists in the form of Al Qaeda in Iraq, taking advantage of an opportunity to go after the Americans. Some of that animated by Sunni Arabs who felt disenfranchised by now the Shia taking over in Iraq, as opposed to the minority Sunni Arab regime of Saddam Hussein. Lots of complex dynamics there, obviously. Sunni, Shia, Arab and Kurd, Christian, Yazidi, Shabak, you name it, Turkmen, and all kind of different flavors. And then the tribes overlaid on top of that, and political parties that emerged in addition to the other elements in society. So again, very complex context in which to fight. And of course, they couldn't stand up to us conventionally, so they had to resort to what might be best described as guerrilla warfare of various different types, and trying to build greater power, but not able to do so, certainly as long as we were there. And ultimately, of course, during the surge in Iraq, we essentially destroyed Al Qaeda in Iraq. In other words, rendered them incapable of accomplishing their mission and preventing them from reconstituting. And then also destroyed the Sunni insurgent groups and then the Shia militia supported by Iran. And none of those reemerged, in violence down by nearly 90% during the 18-month period of the surge. And then, of course, continued to drive it down over the next 3.5 years until the final departure of our combat forces and General Austin, now our Secretary of Defense, the final four-star commander in Iraq's departure. And sadly, then the Prime Minister took some ruinous decisions that took the security forces' eyes off of Al Qaeda in Iraq, by then the Islamic State. And they did what insurgents, guerrillas, extremists want to do, which is build an army. And they, of course, they did that over in Syria, drawing strength from the Sunni Shia civil war there, and then swept back into northern and western Iraq and established a caliphate there, the first ever in modern times of Islamist extremists.
So, sort of a follow up on the Iraq insurgency. I mean, and please correct me if the question is perhaps flawed or I'm not understanding it in the appropriate way. But, when we talk about not perhaps the end, but like the conventional war fighting that defeated the army of Saddam Hussein, the capture of Baghdad, and so on, what was sort of the time gap between when that insurgency that followed actually, quote unquote, matured? Am I understanding that right? Or was it always sort of lingering and just metastasizing like a cancer?
No, it actually developed. We had a period of very, very low violence. And in some areas, things are going very, very well. The 101st Airborne Division, for example, after clearing and holding, seizing the cities of Najaf, Karbala, Hilla, and some others, and then South Baghdad, in a sense, in the wake of the Armor Division, which would blow by these cities, but then the enemy forces were right on their lines of communication, which were critical because they were literally running out of fuel and ammunition at various moments. And then we moved into South Baghdad. We were supposed to stay in that area, including the airfield, which is in West Baghdad, because we needed the hard stand for our 254 helicopters and all the maintenance facilities and all the rest of that. And instead, we had to air assault north on very short notice. I think it was 36 hours to quell what was developing into a very worrisome security situation in Mosul, where there was a small Marine battalion that had been engaged in essentially a demonstration, a riot, in which 17 Iraqis were killed. They had to retreat to the airfield. They were hunkered down there. We went in and immediately sprinted into the city with a brigade of infantry and attack helicopters, quelled everything, got it under control, and had things going very well. We did an election up there, a selection, a caucus within 2 weeks of my arrival, which was the day after we went in. We had a provincial council that was representative of and responsive to all the elements of society, although we couldn't add women initially. We added that later, several months later. But it was really working. We had a great governor. He'd been house arrest by Saddam, had the Medal of Honor. His brother had been killed, was the Air Force chief. And then, unfortunately, when the Coalition Provisional Authority came in a couple of months later and carried out these really, again, um, counterproductive is not adequate description of firing the military and the bureaucrats without any way forward for them. That really cut us off at the knees. We had to regain momentum and so forth. We were able to do it in Mosul, in Nainawa province, because I got an exception from the ambassador who was the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority to allow me to do reconciliation on our own as a test basis. And that actually worked. So the period of very good activity and low violence was extended. But then you could see during that summer of 2003 and into the fall, the gathering momentum of largely Sunni insurgents at that time. And then you had the emergence of essentially Islamist extremists in the form of al-Qaeda, who were willing to carry out even more extreme action, including increasingly over time suicide bombings of various types, both suicide vest and then suicide car bombs. And unfortunately, by the time late 2006, when we decided to do the surge, we started that in February 2007, and I was, of course, the commander of that. There were about 110 suicide bombers entering Iraq through Syria every month, probably some others domestically generated. And that had to be a huge target of our security effort, one of the major efforts that we undertook there. But no, the insurgency began, I'd say, the summer of 2003, fall of 2003. And again, various motivations, not just the fact that individuals have been cast out of their jobs in society with no real redress, except, again, in the area where we were, but also because of the, again, sense of Sunni Arab disenfranchisement with Saddam, who led a minority Sunni Arab. Keep in mind that Sunni Arab in Iraq were somewhere between 17 and 20% of the population. The Kurds were roughly 17% or so, most Sunni, but again, saw their identity as Kurds more than Sunni, certainly not Sunni Arab. And then the Shia Arab were obviously the rest, somewhere around 60% or so, with some small, very small numbers of Christians, larger number of Yazidi, Shabak, again, Turkmen, and other minority elements.
So, a lot of folks will often make the comparison between Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam. You dedicate a lengthy chapter in your book to Vietnam. Many folks have described Vietnam as unwinnable. Are the comparisons between, the two wars in the Middle East I mentioned and Vietnam apt? Are they sufficient?
In general, no. No. I mean, generally, they are not. There are certainly some common features, and we certainly made mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan. And huge mistakes in Vietnam. The biggest distinction, first of all, between Vietnam and Afghanistan, because a lot of people characterize in Afghanistan, depending on when you want to start the clock in Vietnam, Afghanistan was the longest war in our history. Again, it's slightly debatable depending on where you actually want to say that the Americans began in Vietnam. But Afghanistan was sustainable. Sustainability is measured in terms of the expenditure of blood and treasure, our blood and treasure. And we hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months by the time we withdrew until that tragic suicide bombing at Abbey Gate at Kabul airfield. And the cost in treasure and money was very sustainable, 25 billion out of a 800 plus $billion defense budget. And especially with a sense of what might follow. I said publicly that I feared a psychological collapse of the Afghan security forces when they realized that, of course, we were gone, the coalition was gone, and then that their own aircraft, which were the critical element to their entire strategy, which is that you have relatively modestly trained and equipped police and soldiers protecting all of the major urban areas and critical infrastructure, and then you have this very highly trained, highly motivated, well-equipped 35,000 strong Afghan commandos who come to the rescue in what turned out to be overly sophisticated American helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and so forth, which couldn't be maintained by the Afghans without the 17,000 contractors we withdrew. Now, they were also maintaining the mine-resistant armor-protected vehicles, a variety of other American systems, weapon systems, and so on. But they had to withdraw when our forces withdrew, and it proved impossible, really, to conduct maintenance by FaceTime from Qatar with a translator into Afghanistan. So, but it was sustainable. Yes, it was frustrating. We were dissatisfied with the results. It was some of our counterparts in Kabul were maddening. There was corruption that was debilitating. There were, again, innumerable reasons to be dissatisfied with the situation in Afghanistan after 20 years. But that war did not have to end. It's not axiomatic that endless wars have to end. In fact, the phrasing was all wrong. Typically, we would say in Washington, we have ended the Afghanistan war. We haven't ended the Afghanistan war, as was clearly evident. We ended our involvement in the war in Afghanistan. The war continued, and it didn't end up the way we hoped it would. The same phrase was used when we pulled our troops out of combat forces out of Iraq in late 2011. Again, we didn't have to do that. Witness the fact that the reason ostensibly was that we could not get a parliamentary approved status of forces agreement, yet we're the ones that established that requirement. We'd had them there for years already without that. And the fact is that a couple of years later, when the Islamic State was threatening the gates of Baghdad, we put 5,000 troops back on the ground without a parliamentary approved status of forces agreement. So again, I think would have been far better if we'd kept a modest number of forces there, could have kept bases operating, establishing, so you didn't have this huge effort when you went back in. And of course, maybe, just maybe, could have kept the prime minister from pursuing some of the ruinous decisions that he did, because that one is on him. That's not on the fact that we withdrew. It's on the fact of what he decided to do right after our final combat forces left. But again, I just do not equate Vietnam with Afghanistan. Vietnam was not sustainable. The losses there were enormous. The cost there was beyond what was possible to continue to bear. You can argue that we'd actually gotten South Vietnam to a reasonable position, and that unfortunately then Congress cut off aid, and that's what precipitated their inability to defend against what, of course, ironically, a conventional invasion, which is what we had forced South Vietnam to prepare for in the very beginning, when we should have been focused on the security in the villages and hamlets. As you know, in the book, I write that it took us 13 years to get the big ideas right, to get the right strategy in Vietnam, that a war of attrition against the North was not one that we could win. That search and destroy operations where we're thrashing around in the jungle, killing 10 of them for every one of us, perhaps, because the body count became increasingly suspicious as a metric and as in terms of its integrity because of the pressure from the top for this. That just wasn't a war that we could win. And the effects of that, much of what we achieved, you'd take Hamburger Hill, you'll take the Ia Drang Valley, and then within a few months, the enemy's back in there because you don't hold it. Instead, we should have been doing from the very beginning a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign. That should have been the main focus of our forces, even as you carry out other operations to cut lines of communications and so forth. But make the enemy come to you, deny the villages and hamlets and provinces to the insurgents, to the Viet Cong, because that's where they drew their strength. That's where they got their rice, their recruits, and so forth, their sanctuary. And so we focused on the wrong war. We failed to do what Clausewitz cautions is the most important task of a military commander, is to determine the nature of the war that he is fighting and not to make it what you'd like it to be instead of what it really is, which is what we did there. Beyond that, let me compare and contrast Afghanistan and Iraq as well, because I served in Iraq as a 2-star, 3-star, 4-star commander, and then actually as the Central Command commander, so overseeing the whole region in which Iraq and Afghanistan were located. And on my way home from my 3-star tour in Iraq, I was asked to go to Afghanistan by Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld to see how the train and equip mission was going, but also how the war was going in general. And I came back, and the very first slide I laid out to the secretary was one that was titled, Afghanistan does not equal Iraq, and then did a compare and contrast and concluded that Afghanistan, where there was a much lower level of violence than Iraq at that point in time, was actually going to be the longest of the long wars, that the context there was vastly more challenging than that of Iraq for all of the violence and other challenges of Iraq. Most significantly, the enemy of Afghanistan, the Taliban, the Haqqani network, and so forth, the insurgents, as well as, to a degree, the extremists, the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq, and some others, Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, had sanctuary in a neighboring country, in Pakistan. I used to point out to the chief of army staff of Pakistan that there's a reason why the Taliban leadership is called the Quetta Shura. It's because it's located outside Quetta in Baluchistan province of Pakistan, and they're not doing anything about it. And they wouldn't allow us to do anything about it. That is a crippling contextual issue, very, very challenging. Beyond that, in contrast to Iraq, Afghanistan had no money. It had no prospect of, say, $100 billion worth of oil revenue as Iraq did. It had vastly less infrastructure than Iraq, where Saddam Hussein had built military facilities all over the country during the Iran-Iraq War. It had no history of strong central government. It was largely illiterate rather than literate. Very, very significant terrain. The Hindu Kush were vastly more challenging than anything that Iraq had, which basically had, we had urban areas, we had some rivers, some dense foliation, but not much, mostly desert and so on, and no real mountains until you got up into the north in the Kurdish area, which was not an issue for us. So again, I just keep going through all these different issues. And the conclusion was, again, Afghanistan is going to be much more challenging over time because the insurgency is just regrouping. It's just coming back together after having been shattered during the invasion of late 2001. And we'd better watch out. And oh, by the way, the train and equip mission had a number of really serious deficiencies. In fact, the metric on which they focused was the number of Afghans trained. Well, that number is always going up, of course, because you're always training more Afghans. The metric that they should have been focused on is the number of Afghans actually in the ranks. And believe it or not, as we did back of the envelope calculations while I was there, that number was going down. So in other words, they weren't training enough to actually even replace the losses and those that were ending their time in service, going AWOL, what have you. And then you looked at the individual programs. A lot of this was done by contractors. The police training program, it was a 6-week program. And I would usually ask, show me the training schedules, just lay them out on a desk in front of me so I can look at them. And I kept looking at it, thinking there's something missing. And then I realized there is. They never pull a trigger. They never shoot a weapon. So here you are training police who are going to go into an increasingly challenging counterinsurgency mission. They're the local security forces, and they never pull a trigger of a weapon. But by the way, on the training schedule, no kidding, they marched for an hour in the morning and they marched for an hour in the afternoon. And I said, this is drill and ceremony daycare or something. I don't understand what this is all about. We're not trying to produce the old guard or a ceremonial police unit. We're trying to produce a tough police force that can survive in the face of an increasingly challenging insurgency. So again, the deficiencies were very, very considerable. And frankly, it took us probably 8 years in Afghanistan to get the right strategy. John McChrystal deserves credit for that. At that time, I was his boss as a Central Command commander. And then another year to get all the other inputs almost right, the number of forces that we needed, the right organizational architecture. Again, more tweaks to the strategy, adding a reconciliation component, adding anti-corruption, several different task forces, a real counter-narcotics effort that had real logic to it with crop replacement and all the rest of this. The right number of diplomats, spies, development workers, and so on. But then we only kept that right for about 6 months before we began a drawdown process that really increasingly became more based on conditions in Washington than it was based on conditions on the battlefield. And the truth is that we lack consistency in Afghanistan in each of the administrations and from one administration to the other. So again, many, many significant mistakes in Afghanistan, although I would contend that we had it right for a period of time. Um, Toward the end of General McChrystal's time, the year I was privileged to be the commander, General Allen accomplished the mission set out for us during that period. But then the pace of the drawdown exceeded the progress on the ground. And we always conveyed a sense to the enemy that we wanted to leave. This is not a good approach if you're in a contest of wills. In fact, in the speech by President Obama at West Point, in which he announced the buildup of our forces, which was very important, an additional 30,000 American troops with a little overage on top of that, and then additional coalition forces. In that same speech, he announced, but oh, by the way, we're going to start the drawdown in the summer of 2011. It just was not necessary, except, I guess, in domestic political terms. Even there, it's probably questionable. But it sends a message to the enemy that you don't want to stay there. I guess the argument would be, well, it also sends a message to the Afghans that we're not going to be there forever and they need to get on with it. But I think that the damage done was greater than whatever benefit that may have had in terms of the message to Kabul. So Afghanistan, again, very, very challenging context, much, much more so than Iraq. And the truth is that in Iraq, when we went back for the surge and we reversed what we've been doing 180 degrees to go from clear and leave operations to clear, hold, and build, and in other words, staying in the neighborhood, 77 additional locations so that we could live with the people, which is the only way to secure them. When we embarked on that, again, that worked. And you create gated communities, you use biometric ID cards, you search an area painstakingly, find all the elements of al-Qaeda in Iraq, Sunni insurgents, Shia militias supported by Iran, and just keep expanding the security bubble, the ink blot, what have you. And then in major cities, Fallujah, Ramadi, Bakuba, basically separating them into gated communities. I think we had 12 or 13 in Fallujah, telling the people in advance, we're going to make your lives better by getting al-Qaeda out of your lives and the Sunni insurgents, and then proving it to them and then showing them. And it's not just that you establish security, it's that you solidify it by what you do then to rebuild schools, clinics, roads, bridges, markets, other infrastructure, and revive a community. And it was amazing how quickly they would come back when we undertook that strategy. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, driving violence down over 18 months of the additional forces by nearly 90%.
So I want to use the last third of this interview to talk about the wars in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. So with Ukraine, I think when we read and we analyze and we watch what's been happening there, it's unique in the context of modern conflict, particularly when comparing it to the last 20 years. As you said earlier in the interview, you talked about the new technologies and new unmanned vehicles that have been used. But I think you also wrote in your book about how the war fighting is a bit reminiscent of the tactics used during the world wars. What has made this conflict unique, and what's your take on the current war efforts?
Well, what makes Ukraine somewhat unique is that actually Max Boot, the great Washington Post columnist and historian biographer, captured it beautifully when he said that Ukraine is the war in which All Quiet on the Western Front, a World War I novel, meets Blade Runner, of course, a futuristic scenario. And that's very true. You see trenches, you see bunkers, you see vast minefields, barbed wire, concertina, even in a sense, the use of gas, albeit CS gas, riot gas. You see heavy use of artillery, of course, the tanks and fighting systems of really the latter Cold War era. It's very familiar, frankly, in that regard, the weapon systems, to when I was the operations officer for a heavy brigade in Germany with M1 tanks and M2 Bradley fighting vehicles. And yet it increasingly features vast numbers of unmanned systems. In fact, the Ukrainian innovation in particular has been breathtaking. Uh, Ukraine produced 1.5 million drones in the first 9 months of this year. There's no way that any other country in the world can do that. The mythology is that these are cheap drones, not very effective. They're cheap, but very effective. Many of them, to be sure, are one way, first person view. You actually look at what the drone is doing, you fly it right into an armored vehicle or an individual, a trench line, what have you. And it's thousands of these that Ukraine is using in the front lines every day that are somewhat equalizing what otherwise would be a very unequal fight. Again, despite the qualities of Ukrainian strategic leadership, military leadership, fighting on the front lines, the bravery, the courage, the initiative, the determination, all of this. The bottom line is that Ukraine is outnumbered in manpower, at least 4-1. The Russians can throw vast quantities of money at recruiting additional soldiers. It's a year's salary equivalent, big death benefits if they're killed. And so far, Russia's mothers and fathers have not said, not my son. Will that moment come? I certainly hope so. Maybe it's one reason that you see North Korean soldiers being trained in Russia right now. There may be some challenges emerging, but the Russians can just throw soldiers at the front lines. Yes, every now and then they innovate a bit as well. Their electronic warfare is very impressive. Their use of glide bombs is tragically very horrifically effective. They have targeted very assiduously every thermal power plant in the country, every hydroelectric power plant, and now the transformers and distribution infrastructure around the nuclear power plants. But this innovation has been very, very impressive. How do you explain a country that has no navy as we normally think of it, as surface combatants to speak of, Ukraine, sink 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet? Well, with aerial drones that find the ships and then maritime drones that they produce that sink them. And it's forced the Russians essentially to withdraw from the Western Black Sea, which has allowed Ukraine to resume shipping of grain. And they're about still probably 20 to 25% of the world's grain export, not production. And that's crucial for food security for Egypt and some other North African countries in particular. And it's very important for the Ukrainian bottom line. Keeping in mind, again, Russia economy, because they're still able to sell gas and oil, very considerable quantities, is 10 to 15 times that of Ukraine. So this innovation has been hugely important. What needs to happen, of course, is that Ukraine needs to generate more forces of its own. It had its own internal 6 month emotional debate on the conscription law that made changes. They now need to really build out the conscription institutions, if you will, to actually conscript, then train, equip, organize, and employ new replacements and new units. They're building out the drone battalions and brigades very, very impressively. They're the first military in the world, I believe, that has an Army, Navy, Air Force, and unmanned systems force. And I spent an afternoon with a drone battalion recently. Very, very impressive what they're doing. By the way, they're all competing with one another as well. There's dozens probably of these battalions at this point. It's many of the really most impressive IT talent of Ukraine, which is saying a lot. They have a unique partnership between the designers, the manufacturers, and those that employ them. And they actually, you're scored. And it's all digital. You know whether you destroyed a tank or not, an infantry fighting vehicle. Self-propelled artillery gets more points than towed artillery, and on and on. And they're ranked, graded on all of this, and it's really quite extraordinary. It's all populated in an app on the phone, so you can see how you're measuring up with the other battalions. But it's a pretty deadly business, and the frontline fighting is very, very challenging. The Ukrainians are giving up incremental gains to the Russians, not strategic in terms of their consequence yet, but we're in a worrisome way. And what we need to do with the Ukrainians generated additional forces is to help them even more than we have to change the dynamic on the battlefield so that Vladimir Putin finally realizes that he cannot achieve further gains at an acceptable cost, at which time he might be willing to negotiate seriously, and at which time we need to come in and say, okay, Ukraine, if you reach a ceasefire with them, we will guarantee it by an ironclad security agreement led by the U.S. necessarily, and whether it's NATO membership or not possible because of a country like Hungary or some other, it is at least a U.S.-led coalition of the willing. That'll be tough in Washington, but that's what's necessary if you're actually going to end the fighting and the killing and the dying and the damage and destruction and allow Ukraine to rebuild its economy, its infrastructure, homes, schools, even hospitals that have been struck by the Russians.
Absolutely. So now, shifting to the other war that a lot of folks are focusing on, the war in Gaza. A lot has been made of the massive civilian casualties, the sheer destruction in Gaza. We're seeing a complexity now, like the Iran-Israel exchanges of strikes. But, sort of going to the civilian casualties bit, because that's, I think, been the cause of so much emotion that has been dominating, I think, political discourse here. I believe, General, in Afghanistan, Iraq, when we sort of observed urban warfare there, I guess we didn't see reports with such consistency about this type of destruction. So, General, I mean, how did you navigate urban warfare, in sort of your service, and how do you view the current war in Gaza and, the efforts there?
Well, look, first and foremost, as a general statement, I should note that as in these 5 combat commands that I was privileged to have in the post 9/11 wars, I always had a sign on the wall in the operations center that was facing me that asked, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? So that's a measure. And if it's going to create more bad guys and it takes off the street, you need to think really hard about whether you're going to do it. And clearly, all of our rules of engagement stressed minimizing loss of innocent civilian life, damage to infrastructure, et cetera. But we never faced a situation anywhere near as diabolically challenging as that in Gaza. And the difference there, and to a degree, by the way, in southern Lebanon, is the extraordinary subterranean tunnel system and other facilities built over many years that you've got to blow up. You've got to penetrate to those because taking soldiers in there is just going to be a really challenging mission, even with all of the technology that the Israelis can bring to bear and have been bringing to bear. And of course, the fact that Hamas and Hezbollah put this infrastructure under civilian dwellings, hospitals, mosques even. And so this is a real conundrum. And I'm a bit reluctant to, if you will, to look over the shoulder of my Israeli former comrades without knowing what was the target, what was the military necessity. That's the phrase, of course, and when you look at these laws of land warfare and Geneva Convention, what was their assessment of what was required? What's the weaponeering? What did they think were going to be the likely consequences? And then weighing, again, the military necessity versus the, again, possible innocent loss of life and so on. There's no question that the loss of civilians, children clearly can't be construed as Hamas fighters, women, the same thing, has been very considerable. It has to give anyone pause, I think. But again, I'm not going to sit here and kind of grade their work without knowing what it was they had to do, were seeking to do, assessed would be the results, and so forth. And while the horrific nature of 10/7 would never justify, again, throwing the Geneva Convention out the window, and I don't think it has, you do need to be conscious of how horrific that day was. I think it's very important always to begin with an understanding of how traumatic that day was for all Israelis. It's the worst day in their history. The equivalent for us of what they sustained noting that we lost not quite 3,000 lives in the 9/11 attacks, would be 40,000 killed and 7,000 taken hostage. So think about that. And then also recognize that this is the worst intelligence failure in Israeli history, and there have been some others, Yom Kippur War among them, the worst military readiness failure, and the worst political miscalculation or political analysis, keeping in mind that the prime minister and others actually thought that Hamas was becoming a good neighbor, if you will, and taking it, not a good neighbor, but a less bad neighbor, I guess, and was enjoying the additional worker visas that were being provided to them, and perhaps this could be worked out and so forth. And that obviously was a massive miscalculation. So what does need to happen here, though, and Israel has done an extraordinary job of degrading Hamas, basically rendering every one of its battalions at this point probably operationally ineffective, killing the senior leaders, Yahya Sinwar most recently, and of course the political leader prior to that in a guest house in Tehran, of all places. Quite an intelligence coup there. The problem is that they have not destroyed Hamas, and that actually was their explicit objective, and also to keep Hamas from ever governing Gaza again, and of course getting the hostages back. And unless Israel actually decides on a vision for Gaza, announces that they want to provide a better future for the Palestinian people, they have to do that by achieving security. And if they actually secure these areas, I've argued from north to south sequentially with walls east-west and then walls north-south every mile or so, much more in Gaza City. You clear them painstakingly, very similar to what we did in the urban areas in Iraq during the surge. Give biometric ID cards, you get people back into the vicinity of their homes if they're damaged, or into them if they're not damaged, although much, 65% or more of the structures are damaged or destroyed. Better temporary accommodations, and then start not just to provide humanitarian assistance in an organized fashion, which is not possible right now because it gets hijacked by remnants of Hamas or criminal gangs or Palestinian Islamic Jihad remnants. Then you can also restore basic services, begin reconstruction, et cetera, et cetera. Then, by the way, you can bring in Palestinian security forces that we may have trained at the Jordan International Police Training Center. Arab forces will come in if there is security. They're not going to come in and fight Hamas on behalf of Israel, nor will Palestinians fight Hamas, however much they may hate Hamas in certain other segments of the Palestinian population. And you can use contractors then as well to augment the Israeli forces and allow them to do what only they can do, which is to extend the security further, confront Hamas, and engage the people as well. That is not presently envisioned. What Israel's doing is clear and hold operations, very similar to what we did in 2006 prior to the onset of the surge, when we shifted to clear, hold, and build, which is what I believe is inescapable for the Israelis if they want to truly destroy Hamas to prevent them from reconstituting, which they're doing regularly with plenty of recruits, albeit without the access now. Rightly, Israel has taken control of the southern border between Gaza and the Sinai, controls the Rafah crossing and the tunnels under that area called the Philadelphia Corridor, through which much of the weapon systems, ammunition, and materials for this vast underground infrastructure were transported. That can't happen now. That's very important. They should never give that up, or certainly not until there's a trustworthy regime. But if you actually want to achieve a situation in which there's some possibility of Palestinians in Gaza living side by side with their Israeli neighbors, you're not going to do it unless you truly destroy Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, prevent them from reconstituting in terms of fighters, extremists at least, and then over time get better security forces in there, better local governance, and so forth. Nothing quick about that, but it is, in my view, the only alternative that can both achieve the goals relative to Hamas. By the way, you'll also get all the hostages back in that case, and provide a better future for the Palestinian people, which should be one of the explicit objectives of Israel's campaign against Hamas and dealing with Gaza.
General, my last question, as we're running up on time here, but very sophisticated threat matrix. We're seeing war evolve before our eyes. How would you advise the next president, regardless of who they are?
Well, first of all, we haven't talked about the most important region of the world, which is, of course, the Indo-Pacific. And there are several issues to remember here. First, the overarching advice is to continue to build on what is emerging as a comprehensive, integrated whole of governments approach, so all of our allies and partners together, to ensure deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region. Noting that deterrence is founded on two elements: the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and your willingness to use those capabilities on the other. And what we have to do is transform our capabilities even more rapidly than we are, even as we continue to improve the defenses of our bases in the Indo-Pacific, harden them further, put headquarters underground, disperse them, increase the capabilities, et cetera, but also begin a transformation from a small number of very large platforms that are incredibly capable, heavily manned, exorbitantly expensive, and increasingly vulnerable, any surface combatant and above, to a vast number, almost unimaginable number of unmanned systems that increasingly will be algorithmically not even remotely piloted. Again, that's a very simplistic description, but that's what we need to do in addition to shoring up the other elements of a comprehensive integrated whole of governments approach, noting that the previous U.S. administration changed the conversation on the Indo-Pacific. The current administration built it out, and the next one should continue to build on that. And I think it will. I think there will be much more continuity in that regard than there is change. Then to recognize that what you do in one part of the world reverberates in the Indo-Pacific. If you want a potential adversary to think that you will actually have the will to use your forces if something untoward happens, you got to recognize that if you don't support Ukraine in its hour of need, that undermines that perception. If you don't do everything you can for Israel and the Gulf states against Iran, that can undermine that. Just like the Syrian red line on chemical weapons use that turned out not to be a red line, or the withdrawal from Afghanistan when that was not really necessary. We could have continued that war, and we would not be where we are in that country, which is just absolutely disastrous. I said when the announcement was made that the Biden administration would follow through with what the Trump administration agreed, that we would come to regret that decision. I certainly hope we have, because we've consigned that country, one that we helped for 20 years on the ground, to a future of a 7th or 8th century interpretation of Islamist extremism that is very, very disheartening, not just for the half of the population that is women, but now even for the men as well. But again, focus on the main effort, but then recognize that what you do in one part of the world reverberates in others, and that we do have the ability to continue to support Ukraine even more robustly than we have, reduce the restrictions on the use of our weapons that are most effective on Russian territory, help the Israelis in every way we can, noting that we may have some differences about how we go about it, how they do it, although they've been extraordinarily effective against Hezbollah in particular, and may have restored deterrence now with this quite substantial but measured set of airstrikes against the air defense systems of Iran, perhaps paving the way for the future if necessary, and then the manufacturing and storage and other facilities that enable their drones and missiles. So I think, again, it is having a world view. It's placing the Indo-Pacific central in that, but also recognizing that you still need to carry out these other operations where, by the way, our men and women are not fighting and dying in Ukraine. We're engaged in the Middle East, but again, very, very few casualties there as well. And really quite important that we continue our commitments there also.
General Petraeus, thank you so much for joining me here today. The newest edition of your book, Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Gaza, is out now. We'll have a link to that book in this episode description. But General, once again, thank you for coming back on the podcast as always.
Great to be with you. Thanks.